All right. Well, we have some introductory slides. We'll get through that. We'll get started here. I think more people will be joining here shortly. But let's just kind of get through everything. My name is Patrick Corbett. I'm one of the volunteers here at Design for Drupal. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time this year, we've switched things up. Obviously, we can't meet in person anymore. We normally have our event in Boston in the summer, but we've decided to switch things up and do a virtual webinar each month. So we're glad folks are joining here, and welcome. This is our 12th anniversary this year, and we have a lot of great speakers scheduled this year. I think I'm going to turn it over to Leslie Glenn, who's another volunteer here, who will kind of walk us through some of the basics of the conference, and then I will introduce our speaker today. Leslie?
Great, thank you, Patrick. So as Patrick said, welcome to all of our, everybody that usually comes to Design for Drupal Boston and MIT, and also welcome to everybody from around the world that was able to join us this year. We're really excited to have you. Today's webinar is CSS is Rad. We're thrilled to have Miriam Suzanne back with us to lead this webinar today. We did have a keynote. We did have a couple of events on June 10th, which was our scheduled date for the 2020 Design for Drupal. So we did have a keynote with Christina Chimilis. There is a recording on designfordrupal.org, so feel free to go and check that out. That was a really good keynote. We also had a contribution day, a 24-hour contribution day on that day. So continue to contribute. Go to the Slack channels listed here, admin UI or D9-theme, to contribute either Claro or to Olivero, and those are the new Drupal 8, Drupal 9 themes for admin and for regular site users. There will be mentors there to help you, but anybody can contribute, so don't feel like if you're not a developer, you can't. Front end, accessibility, testing, design, everything, you can contribute. So we appreciate everyone's help on those contribution channels. Our upcoming webinar series, we have these on Wednesdays at noon, typically the second Wednesday of the month, but sometimes we have to switch it up due to conflicts. Our next one is October 14th. We haven't officially settled on a speaker for that, so if anybody knows of anybody that would like to speak on the 14th, please reach out and let Patrick or I know. On November 11th, we're excited to have Johanna Bates and Clayton Dewey, who will be speaking on consentful UX. You can keep track of the upcoming webinars on design4drupal.org. And the recordings from the previous months are there as well. We've had some really good webinars, so please, if you weren't able to join us, go back and check those out at our website. There's a lot of events now that you have access to because the majority of them are virtual at this point. So Drupal Camp Atlanta is happening tomorrow, Thursday and Friday of this week. So feel free to go find their website, and there's trainings and sessions and such. Bad Camp, which is one of the bigger Drupal camps. Typically that's being held virtually this year, October 14th to 17th, 2 days of training and then sessions and all. And I think they're having keynotes for the first time this year. Our local one, Ned Camp, which is New England Drupal Camp, is being held on November 6th. That's a little bit different this year. Instead of sessions and keynotes, we're doing Birds of a Feather, which are just meetings of like-minded folks who wanted to discuss a specific topic. So it's open right now for submissions for people who either have an idea for a Birds of a Feather session, topic to talk about, or if they want to lead a Birds of a Feather discussion group. So feel free to go to look at the NedCamp website and sign up for those. DrupalCon Europe, which was supposed to be held in Barcelona, is being held December 8th to 11th. That is online this year, so that gives everybody an opportunity that might not have been able to get over there to be able to hop on and join that. And then there's local meetups everywhere. The Boston one happens to be on the first Tuesday of the month. That's virtual as well now. The Drupal Association, if you're not a member of that, if you're on Drupal.org but not in the association, check out what joining the association, how it helps the Drupal community and the Drupal project. I happen to be on the board of directors of the Drupal Association, and we are having an election that starts on the 15th for the next community elected board member. So go to the Drupal Association page and sign up to become a member to vote in that election. And reach out to me with any questions on that. The code of conduct, we are a virtual conference, but the code of conduct still applies. It's on the website in the footer. So it's, all the participants in this webinar are expected to follow the code of conduct. If there are any issues, which we don't anticipate, but if there are any issues, please feel free to reach out to Patrick or myself. And I want to just take 1 minute to thank the digital sponsors that make this webinar series possible. I'll just read these quickly. Redfin Solutions, Lullabot, McPhee Design, AGI, Dev Collaborative, Oomph, Isovera, Talking Drupal, 108 Degrees, and Oddbird. So thank you very much to all the digital sponsors that allow us to have these webinars. Spread the word about today's events on social media. Use the hashtag D4D Boston. And just thank you for joining us. Just remember to be kind to everybody you interact with. Everybody's struggling. It's a tough time this year. So the more we can do to be kind to each other, the better. As always, not just this year, always. Use the Q&A feature to ask questions during the webinar. Chat is turned off for webinars, so you won't be able to access that, but use the Q&A tab, and we'll answer those questions at the end, or if Miriam, if there's something that's relevant to what she's speaking about, if she'd like, we can, break in and ask questions there. So I'll let Miriam decide on that. And I think that's it. So we're ready to start the webinar, and I'm going to let Patrick introduce our guest, Miriam.
Thanks, Leslie. Miriam, for those of you who weren't with us last year, spoke at Design for Drupal, and we're really excited to have her back. She is a co-founder of Oddbird, which is an app design and development company, and also one of our sponsors. Thank you, Miriam. She and her company also sponsor and promote inclusiveness and diversity in our industry, and that's something that those of us here who work on Drupal and at Design for Drupal really believe in too. So thank you, Miriam. Miriam is here to share her knowledge about a little thing called CSS. And I'm kind of joking about that because I think CSS is something that a lot of people know a little bit about, but very few people know as much as Miriam does about CSS. And that's not that only a few people can know so much about it, but it is such a it has so much depth and breadth to it that it's easy to kind of skim across and just kind of get by with minimal knowledge. But there's so much more to CSS that we really wanted Miriam to come back and illuminate and sort of show us that there is room to really dig down deep. I know for myself at my company, we've been trying to hire somebody who is sort of our lead front-end CSS person specifically, and that has been a challenge. There aren't a lot of people out there who really live and breathe CSS and HTML and really love working in it. But it looks really exciting. There's a lot of new things coming out for it, and I think when you hear Miriam talk about it, it'll set off a few light bulbs for you because there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with it, and it is truly very rad. So I will stop talking. Miriam, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you again for speaking with us today.
Absolutely, it's nice to be here. Thanks for that introduction. Let's see if I can get all of the things sharing the way they're supposed to. All right. Are we looking at the same thing?
Looks good.
Great. So this is, if you go to slides.oddbird.net, if you want to follow along there or work ahead, spoiler alerts, etc. let's talk about CSS. I work in CSS every day. If you're like me, you spend a lot of time in the browser working in CSS. And if you're online, you've probably seen the meme that CSS is awesome. And although it maybe implies that something isn't quite right here with it honking right out of the box, as they say, we're just going to fix that quick. Good. I think that's basically the talk. Any questions so far? All right. So I want to jump back to 1989. This is when Tim Berners-Lee and the team at CERN are first propose the World Wide Web project and start putting it out there for the world. And in 1989, it's not that long ago, but it's long enough ago that I was not interested in tech at all. That's me in 1989, several years old. That year, I put out my first novel, Choose Your Own Adventure, The Mystery of the Missing Art Box. And this was the career path that I was looking towards. The year later, I put out my epic fantasy novel, The Sward, which was a big hit, I think, in my elementary school class. That's probably not true. But I went on to study theater and drop out of college to run a theater company from 2000 to 2006. And this is what I was planning to do. I had no interest in tech at this time. And one of the things that I love about theater is that many different companies can all start from this same script and then produce it in entirely different ways and even tell somewhat different stories. I mean, you can go see Romeo and Juliet over and over again, and sometimes it's a story about star-crossed lovers, and sometimes it's a story about kids being irrational or something, right? We can tell different stories. We have different actors, different sets, different budgets. The performance is different every time, but there's some through line of the words that are spoken. And one of the theater practitioners that was most inspiring to me was Anne Bogart. She has this concept of the theater viewpoints, which is sort of like the elements of design, but it's also like an agile process for creating original theater. I really love her work, but there's one essay and set of quotes that stand out to me, which is this idea that in theater, we're not trying to make everybody in the audience feel exactly the same way about every moment of the performance. We want to leave room for the audience to move around and imagine and make associations, and everybody should be able to bring their own lives to the show and take away their own experiences and have a conversation afterwards. Now, eventually, our theater company needed a website, and I had played around some with Dreamweaver, but I really wanted something where I could just put shows in as data and then it would figure out whether they're upcoming or had already happened. So I called up my brother, who's a programmer, and asked if he would help me build this. And he said no, but he would show me how. And one of the first links that he sent me was Eric Meyer's CSS Edge experiments. And if you haven't been there, it's still up. And we're way beyond a lot of these experiments at this point, but you can still check them out. There's actually no alpha transparency on this page. It's all faked using images and fixed positioning, and it's a really cool website. I got so inspired by all the weird stuff that Eric Meyer was doing with CSS, and then from there I ended up at the Zen Garden, which is this beautiful site from Dave Shia, where different people could send in different style sheets. Oh, there's one from Dan Mall. And you can load different style sheets over the same HTML. And isn't that wild? And I thought that was just so fascinating. This is what we call in theater the performative turn. It's what allows us to take a script and then figure out how are we going to perform it and turn that into actual people actually on stage performing those lines. It's also what allows us to take a urinal and turn it sideways and sign it. And we've made this performative turn from just an object to a performance of the object. And to me, this is intriguing. I thought this CSS thing, this is a weird performance art project. I need to dig into it more. And the more you dig, it's not just CSS that's this weird performance art project. The entire web is a performance art project because not only can I take HTML and perform it different ways with CSS, but both of those are just scripts that are passed along to the browser, and then each browser decides how to perform that combination of HTML and CSS. So this is just weird performance art the whole way down, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So 1989, the World Wide Web Project, they released the first browser. It's on the Next machine. You can see the Next logo up there. That's what they were using at CERN. It's actually a browser and editor. And we can go to the emulator. Here's the first website loaded up on the emulator. We can actually go there in a browser today and see the same, browse the first website. There it is, the same website on a modern browser and on the first ever browser, and it still works. We can also open a document from reference. Yep, let's go to oddbird.net. So we can pull up Oddbird's modern website on the first browser ever, and it still works fine. There's a few little things like character codes weren't a thing at that point. But anyway, you can go play with that. But there's a problem. So it says in that document that HTML is supposed to be a common language between all platforms. It's supposed to work everywhere. And this eventually becomes the W3C mission statement, web for all, web on everything. And that means we have a problem right away. The first browser is for the Next machine, but the Next machine is this graphic interface with this Windows-like operating system, and that doesn't represent the majority of devices at the time. So we're gonna also have to support this green on black terminal IBM PC and machines that have no visual interface, machines that even can't install this software. So they hire Nicola Pello to build a second browser, which we would, by modern standards, maybe say is worse than the first in terms of the features that it provides. It has no graphic interface. Here I'm in an emulator again. So to move around, we use these little numbers that are in there. So I'm gonna go to the technical, type in the number, HTML format, and then constraints. Now, there's no way for me to zoom in here because you can't zoom in on a terminal. So I'll just show you the quote that it says there at the bottom. Because this is can't be device specific and has to be universal, this implies no device specific markup or anything which requires control over fonts or colors. What? That's us. We're not going to exist on the web. Design on the web is impossible. And this is a radical shift from everything that we've known about publishing. I don't know what mission statement the Gutenberg press would have had if mission statements were popular in 1440, but it's really about being able to recreate the same thing over and over, and not about this idea of totally agnostic to how it's visualized, but we're just going to get the content across. So this is a radical shift from control of the process to less control. So when I'm doing a print design, I can jump into InDesign. I can set exactly what colors. I can set what color space I'm in. I can lay out everything exactly the way I want. This is a friend's book cover. And then when I get the book in the mail, it is exactly the way I designed it. And it's exactly the same for everyone. And that's sort of the power of the printing press. And that's not what we have here. On the web, everything is variable, every single thing. And we think about sizes a lot. The size of the screen can change, and that's true, but also the interfaces, the way that we're interacting with these devices is different. User preferences are changing. The content of our sites, we're often working, I mean, if you're working in Drupal particularly, the content is changing all the time, and you're having to sort of design systems around that. These different devices have different features, different browsers have different features. All of that is variable and we can't control it. So our websites are going to be performed by these wide 4K screens, but then also this entire array of mobile devices from laptops all the way down to smartwatches and even now smart speakers and assistive technology. Our sites are being read to people. There are no fonts or colors. So how are you going to control fonts or colors in a system that is this variable and they just may not exist in some cases? So this whole system is designed to be compatible, not just forwards and backwards, where we can load the first site in a modern browser and we can load a modern site in the first browser, but also sideways, where right away there's two browsers and they have vastly different capabilities. And that's still true, and that's only becoming more and more broad. And the way that that works, this is again from that original document, is that browsers have to be able to ignore your code. That's the fundamental process by which we can be compatible in every direction. Browsers should ignore tags, which they don't understand. And if they do understand the tag, but they don't understand an attribute, ignore the attribute, use the tag. So down to this finest grain, we use what we can and we throw away what we don't understand, which leaves us just entirely too many variables to consider, because browsers are not only different, but they're allowed to ignore us. So we simply cannot plan for the web. Only browsers in this system, only browsers have all the context. A browser knows the size of its viewport, the type of interface, the type of interactions that can happen, the type of device, all these different things. The browser is the only part of this system that has all that context. So we've been understating this for years. We've been saying that websites don't need to look the same in every browser, but the truth is websites cannot possibly look the same in every browser. There is no fundamental way for websites to look the same in every browser unless you choose two browsers and decide that you're only going to support those two, which is sort of counter to the entire point here. So browser differences on the web are a feature and not a bug. It was intended to be this way. Browsers were meant to implement things differently, make decisions based on their context, and allow users to take over control. And if you think about it, the fact that we control the paper page, the fact that we have total control over this is really a limitation, particularly for our users who may decide that this type is too small and there's no way to increase it, and so on and so on. But there's a problem with this, because fonts and colors are great. And if we can't control them, what are we doing? Everybody wanted fonts and colors on the web, both authors and users. We want a more creative medium. We don't want just green text on a black background all the time. So there were a lot of concerns about this coming up around 92, 93. HTML totally eliminates any visual creativity that a document designer might have, and that's a problem. So everybody wanted to fix this problem. When Mosaic came out in 1993, they added the image tag. And you can see here, it became a way to play with fonts and colors on the web. This font doesn't need to exist on your screen. That S doesn't need to exist in any font even. You can just create the image the way you want it, and great, problem solved. But this sort of raised a new issue, which is that the web would have become a giant fax machine. And there was a lot of fear over this, that this could actually kill the web. Everything that's special about adapting to different contexts and different devices might go away if we're just sending pictures back and forth. Pictures don't adapt to anything. What's the point of HTML and the rest of it? So there's sort of an arms race in 93. We can go to the W3C style history. I'll zoom in on that a little bit. And there's a bunch of different proposals here. We're only going to look at a few of them. Robert Reich's, Pei Wei's, and Haokon Lee's, which is the one that we end up with. But they really see themselves at this point as trying to save HTML from either a death of too little design or a death of just becoming a fax machine. So the first one that we're going to look at is Peiwei's language. He actually built it into the Viola browser, which never really took off because it was very limited, the machines it could run on. But it was the first browser that supported style sheets of any kind. And it used his style sheet language here, which if you've written CSS, parts of this might be familiar. We've got some selectors. So there we're selecting the head and the body. At that point, the head wasn't a hidden thing. It was part of the document. And then we've got some nested selectors in H1, H2, A, etc. And then inside of those selector blocks, I mean, I guess we're already talking about SAS style nesting here. Inside the selector blocks, we've got declarations with a property and a value, everything that we're familiar with. And he notes right away that these properties, in order to keep the style sheets short and concise, these properties are going to inherit down the tree unless otherwise overridden. And this allows us to style lots of things all at once, so we're not repeating ourselves and being very specific about every little detail all the time. Robert Reich's style sheets proposal came out around the same time. He refers to this as an easily parsable format. I assume he means for the computer, because this is not easily parsable for me, although we can see some familiar things here. Again, we sort of have selector blocks. Default is acting like our star selector, kind of, or maybe like the HTML selector. And then we've got a list and list item. And then we've got these sort of grouped property and value. Let's dig into some of those. So if we unparse them a bit, faux fa equals T is font family equals times. Although not exactly times. He goes into great detail here about how we're not actually specifying times the font, we're specifying times the type of font. Pick a font like times, give me something similar to that as close as you can get to it. So this is a suggestion of a particular character representation, a style of character. Similarly with font size equals 14, there's no units here. Why aren't there units? And that's because we were going to use a general unit where the browser gets to decide in different contexts what these numbers mean, because the browser is the only part of the system that knows what size is reasonable and can make adjustments based on that. So he talks a lot about suggestions and hints. Styles are suggestions, not rules. A set of hints or suggestions, again, all caps is his. Hints or suggestions to be rendered to the renderer, which might be used. The browser is allowed to ignore this code. We're trying to allow browsers to make appropriate decisions aligned with our intent as authors, but still, we're not controlling fonts or colors here. We're suggesting them, hints and suggestions. Now, in 1994, Mark Andreessen, who had released Mosaic, now releases Netscape Navigator, and he thought this was all a bunch of bullocks. And Netscape Navigator came with the center tag, the multi-col tag, the font tag. He didn't want a separate style language. He thought it should all be in HTML, and he put it in there. So we got this, and this is what people used for quite a while for styling. Font size equals 4, color red, but you have to repeat this tag every time you want to apply something different. There's no way to style multiple things at once, and it's cluttering up the HTML, and it's not semantic. Now, okay, at this point, I still didn't care about the web. Not interested. This is me with my brothers a few years before we started Oddbird, but maybe working on our first team building exercise there. 94 also, just a few days off from the release of Netscape, Haucom Lee sends the W3C list. Well, it's not the W3C yet, but the web project list, cascading HTML style sheets, a proposal. And that's the one that turns into what we know today as CSS. So again, he uses some of the similar language to Robert Reich, providing hints that the browser may or may not use. But a bigger part of his concern even was softening the tension between the author and the reader. Now, what tension between the author and the reader? In his mind, the author is going to want their site to look unique and branded. So they're going to be giving it a distinct look and feel, where the reader is going to want to say, I want the font size to generally be around X, whatever font size I find most readable. I want light text on a dark background, etc. The user is setting up their preferences of what they find readable, and so they're going to be making all sites look more similar. So there's this tension between the fully unique branding of authors and the preferences of users, and he's trying to balance that tension. Author and reader are going to use the same notation so that it's balanced. If they can both write style sheets, we can give them some more even control. So if we're taking multiple style sheets from multiple places, that means we're going to end up with a list and an ordered list or cascade of style sheets. And that's the origins of the cascade, is we've got these style sheets from different places and we have to put them together somehow. So let's dig into the cascade a little bit, both in the way that he proposed it and the way it works now. So he says the user and browser are going to specify initial preferences and then hand the remaining influence over to the document. That's the idea. The document, that's us, whatever we attach to the document itself. So user and browser go first, they style what they care about, and then they leave some for us to style. And if conflicts arise between the two, users should have the last word, but we're able to provide the hints and suggestions to the browser based on what we're trying to do. Now, this gets weird. So some things here in his syntax, h1.font.size, we can read and understand roughly what that means. I mean, it's sort of like a selector and a property all in one syntax, a little bit like JavaScript looks now, although JavaScript didn't exist at that point, so not based on that. So H1 font size equals 16 points, 60%. What's that 60%? It's weighted influence. And this was his idea of how we're going to balance the power between authors and users, is everybody will say how much they care. So the user can send in this style and say, I care 60% about this font size. And then the author can come along and we can say, I care 100% about it, and I want it 24 points. Now, what's the result? The result is the user goes first, they get their 60%, we're bumped down to the remaining 40%, and then we run a weighted average. So their 16 times 60 and our 24 times 40, and then divide that by 100, and we get 19.2 points. And that's how the web is going to work. That's how we're going to balance this power between readers and authors. I love this. This is so weird. So at first I was like, well, we didn't really get anything like this, but I wonder if I could recreate it. And I can. I mean, on the one hand, the user sets a font size and we get access to that as 1em. So on the one hand, we do have access to the user's font size, and we can work with it from there. But let's say we want to set a font size of 3em. There's our author font size. Now, how are we going to get a weighted average between them? And I started playing around with, I can zoom in a little more here. I started playing around with CSS custom properties to capture the user size and then the author size. Let's get rid of those and do it all here. We'll give the user a weight. They're going to take their 60%. And then we're going to run the calculations here. The author weight, the resulting author size, user, etc. We get the average and we can apply that here. And we get something in between the two. And we can change this. So if the user takes 100%, it's going to go all the way down. And if the user takes 0%, it goes all the way up. And otherwise, we get something in between. So we can do that. I don't know if we should or want to. But from there, I started thinking, well, actually, this weighted influence, we didn't really get it, but we sort of got a binary version of it. everything is just a 0 weight. It can be totally overridden by any other style unless we give it important, and then that's 100% weight, and it takes over completely. So we just get 0 and 100, but we do have this sort of idea of the weighted styles somewhat in there. He also proposed that we could load multiple style sheets at different weights and see them cascade together. Here he is suggesting that we load the New York Times style sheet and the Le Monde style sheet and combine the two. So of course I tried that. The results weren't very interesting. And part of the reason is at that point they would have mostly been styling tags, the elements themselves. And these days we mostly style classes, attributes, maybe IDs. So in a document that doesn't have those classes, IDs, and attributes, we're basically only getting the reset styles. But here it is, the New York Times and Le Monde joined together. I wasn't able to do any weighting on that, but he takes this even farther. So he has this idea that what we'll be able to do is have the user styles and the author styles, and then provide sliders where the user can change their weighting of each individual factor and get exactly the styles that they want that are a combination of their preferences and the authors. And this is his diagram direct from his proposal of how that might work. Now, several people pointed out right away that if you want blue text on a yellow background and the user wants yellow text on a blue background, weighting those two, you end up with green on green, maybe not great. So this never really took off. There's some problems with it, but I love the idea here. And there's definitely more you can do with it. We do play at Oddbird with giving users some control over, say, pick your own color scheme, change the hue, and there are things you can do with it, but it's not exactly this back and forth between user and author weighting. So this whole idea turns into what we now call the cascade, which starts with the cascade origins. I mean, I suppose he called it the cascade, but we now refer to the cascade origins as these 3 places that styles come from. So that's the user agent or browser, the user, and us as authors. And that starts with the user agent defaults. The browser is providing some basic readable defaults for HTML so that HTML on its own looks good. And whoops, in Firefox, we can go to that here, resources, GRE resources. My favorite resource here is the broken image. There you go. That's what a broken image looks like. That one's not broken. It's just like that. HTML.css is what we want. Starts with some bidirectional styles. Then we get down to, oh, that's again bidirectional. Here's blocks. So setting block display on all of our block elements. And that's because the spec doesn't determine what elements are display block. Display is defaults to inline. So the browser has to come in and be like, okay, but some things are block display. The margin gets this 8 pixel that everybody removes. And then we get all sorts of other styles here. And you can see the browser is able to use new syntax that's not available to us generally yet, or is available but isn't cross-browser supported well yet. These are starting to get there, and you should start using them soon. They can also use new selectors right away, as long as they know that this browser supports it. And they don't really have to be careful about specificity or importance. They do use important here. You can see they have quite complex selectors, and we can override those without adding our own complex selectors because of how the cascade works, because of how cascade origins work. There's a few other things we can do here. So let's go back to Oddbird and pull up a new style sheet. And let's say star, so everything, and then all the properties, revert important. There we go. Okay, we're getting some black background there from something, but we've reverted here to the browser styles. You can see they're setting up basic lists, header styles, various other things. We've got these block elements. Everything is not inline. If we were to use initial, that would take us all the way back to what the spec says, which is everything is display inline. And it's a bit harder to read. You can see why the browser is providing some defaults. So initial takes you the whole way back to the spec default, where revert takes you back to the browser styles. That's a quick way to see what's going on. So then on top of those, we get user styles. And initially, the idea is that those are going to be written in the same syntax. Now, that was true for a while. That's less and less true. Now we're more likely to interact with user styles through the user preferences, but we can do things like change the default font size, adjust the colors. We can even insist that our colors always override the colors of the website. So there is still that balance of power. It's just usually this limited set of features that a user is likely to interact with, but they can still do that. So user styles get added on top, and then author styles, we come in and we can do the remainder, whatever we want on top of that. So these three are sort of stacked in an order. The browser goes first, then the user can add their styles on top of that, and authors, we come in at the end. And we're at the top of the stack. We take precedence, which is not what he had in mind. If a conflict arises between the user and if a conflict arises, the user should have the last word. And we're just attaching style hints. So this is the reason that we get importance. Importance flips those and reverses them. And we get this sort of snake draft that you get in games a lot, where we go last in the first round, but then we go first in the second round. So our styles are there in the middle of the pack. The browser actually gets to say some things you just cannot do on this machine, on this browser. Those are off limits. The user gets to say some things like my colors are very important and I'm not going to allow you to override them. And our styles are right there in the middle. So we don't think of importance as doing this flipping and reversing thing because our styles just don't move very far. They're still our styles. They're still all there together. So importance feels like specificity, but really it's this balance of power between the sources, between the origins. There's a few other origins. Transitions and animations actually create their own origins, which is a clever little bit of logic that the browsers do, but we're not going to go into it. This initial proposal also includes media queries. Right away, he's thinking about how are we styling for different media right from the beginning. It has a speech query. This never really took off. Assistive technology like screen readers don't actually consider themselves speech media. They're screen media. They're just reading the screen, right? So they don't actually want to give you control over decibels. The user is going to control that. So speech media query never really took off. There's a lot of complexity there, but it was in this initial proposal. One of my favorite media queries in the initial proposal was the age query, where we can say, if the document is more than 3 days old, turn the background yellow. And I love that. More things on the web should degrade slowly. I think that's a great feature, and maybe I'll need to implement it on my website somehow. Also, an article that's more relevant to the user. We should be able to tell relevance to the user and then have a headline that's bigger. And there's actually something interesting in there that H1 font size times equals 1.5. That's saying take the current font size and multiply it by 1.5. And we didn't get that syntax, but we did get that idea. We got font size 1.5M, which is exactly the same concept. And I think relative units are really a great example of exactly what they mean by authors conveying intent that the browser can then work with. So we're not just saying 24 pixels or whatever 1.5 Ms would be here. We're telling the browser exactly what we mean and exactly what we intend by using these units so that the browser can make smart decisions for us. And this whole thing is designed to be resilient, again, to fail beautifully, just like HTML fails beautifully, where in HTML, browsers should ignore tags and ignore attributes that they don't understand. We get exactly the same sort of idea in CSS. So when we use a selector that some browsers don't understand, this is selector that's fairly new, browsers just ignore that entire block if they don't understand the selectors. And again, down to the finest detail. If a browser doesn't understand display grid, it can fall back to an earlier value of display, like display flex, or even back to the browser default display block. And we get this sort of, this same backwards, sideways, and forwards compatibility out of just failing beautifully. And this leads to what Jen Simmons calls quantum CSS. This magic of CSS is that you can use it and not use it at the same time. When you write display grid, some browsers are going to use that and some browsers are not going to use that, and it works and it doesn't work at the same time. This is quantum CSS. It's a particle and it's a wave, and it's not some binary where we can jump into can I use and get a yes or no answer that this feature is or is not supported. Can I use even tries to convey a little bit more complexity around that. So we can say grids here. Oh, they added a dark mode, interesting. And we can see they've got not only some greens and some reds, but some yellows in the middle that show us partial support. And various ways of calculating that support and filtering to see different browsers. But we still often think of it like we can just jump in there, narrow it down to our set of browsers, and if it's all green, we get a yes, and if there's some red, we get a no. And that's not really how the web is intended to work. We're supposed to get something more complex out of that. I built may I use, which we can just say grid here. Oh, yes, of course. Please do. That's all it does. It gives you permission. And this feels complicated, but we already know how to do this. The term responsive web design was coined in 2010 and has been super popular ever since. And when we're doing responsive web design, we don't rewrite our styles for every single viewport, every single device. That would be absurd. We can't plan for all of that. There's simply too many variables to consider. And we don't worry about all of them. We sort of set up some breakpoints that get us close to some idea of what we're going for. And even before the web, we've been doing this in product design. We know how to make car seats that move back and forth. Can you imagine people being like, but my car seats need to look the same in every car for every person? No, the car seats are fit to the car and they move back and forth so that people can fit in them. And we even get more control over this. So font stacks are a perfect example of this being built directly into the language. We're not setting a font, we're suggesting a font, and then we're suggesting, if you don't have that font, maybe try this one, and on down to monospace. So it's similar to Robert Reich's initial proposal. We don't get to declare times necessarily, but we get to say what type of font we want ideally. So how do we code for this resilience where we've got so many more variables than we consider? And there's several ways that we're going to look at. The first is trusting the flow, trusting that CSS is pretty smart by default. It makes pretty good decisions already right away. So we're going to try to define some constraints and let the language work out the details. We're going to define as little as we can and otherwise let it flow. So when I talk about flow or normal flow, it's a layout system that never really had a name before we had other layout systems. So once we added grid and flexbox and so on, we had to name the base state, which is called normal flow. And it's pretty powerful. InDesign can't do this. When I change the size of the page, everything just sort of flows together and we get these block elements and we get some inline elements, and the inline elements wrap around corners, but the block elements stack up and we can put space between them. it's a pretty powerful layout system, and we want to use it. If we start removing things from the flow, the browser can't make smart decisions about how things move in relation to each other. And that's actually sort of what's happening here. What's happening here is we've over-specified what the layout should do. We've taken control away from the flow, and we really want to come in here and say, well, what if we don't set a max width? What if the max width is min content? Or what if we changed here, overflow wrap from normal to anywhere, break word? We can set different things. Break word's not going to force it to break unless we change this back. We can play with all sorts of different types of overflow. So we could also say overflow scroll. Guess we want to change this back to normal for that one, and we can see there we get a scroll bar. There's actually lots of different things we can do with overflow, which is quite a bit more powerful than what I can do in a tool like InDesign, where it just hides any text that overflows and it's gone forever. And the only way to get it back is to change the size larger. I don't really understand what the problem is here that we're complaining about, or what a better overflow would be. The default is visible because CSS doesn't want to hide any of your content. It wants to make sure that all of your text is readable and visible, even if you've done something that went and broke the layout. So the next thing is that we can do is just let things fail. And we can look at a few ways of doing that. One of the simplest examples of just letting things fail is maybe a bit outdated at this point, but border radius. At one point, border radius was new, and some of us remember that time when we were doing sliding door images to get border radius. But this is one where you can just let it fail, and the worst outcome is you get square corners, and you know, life goes on. If some users see a square corner, I'm going to be fine. And you can see here, I'm testing border radius support, not by jumping into an old browser that doesn't support border radius, but just by commenting it out, because that's what the browser does. The browser just ignores a line it doesn't understand. So if the browser doesn't understand border radius, it's just going to ignore it, and I can test that. I can just comment that or uncomment it. Similarly, I can do something with selectors where I can change the color of markers on the site, list markers. And this doesn't have wide support yet. I think it actually is landing in the next version of Chrome. It's already here in Firefox, and I think Safari has some basic support. So it's about to be pretty widely available, but it doesn't even matter. I don't care if that fallback is just going to be fine. I can just let that fail, and it doesn't need to be exactly the same. In fact, it can't be exactly the same. Shapes. When I've got something floated, I can give it a shape. And I'm actually going to, by default, I gave it this rectangle because that's easy for me to remember and start from. Because then I jump into here. Well, let's find that element. Here it is. That shape, I can click this polygon tool, and I get the shape here with little handles I can move around. Double click to create a new handle. And this is way easier than writing that code myself, but I can play with these shapes. And again, I can test what's going to happen on browsers that don't support shape outside. Well, it's going to go back to square. That's fine. That's a fine fallback. No issues there. So there's lots of cases, and it's not going to be every case, but there's lots of cases where we can do this, just letting it fail. Text decoration's another one. I'll just sort of quickly show these: text decoration thickness, changing the text decoration color. And again, those fallbacks are fine. Scroll snap type, I can set the scroll snapping and a target on each of these figures, and now it will always snap to the start of one of them. Let's say I want them offset a little bit. I can do that either from the container or from the figure itself with a margin. Now I'm going to get both at once. Probably don't want that. But anyway, we can test a browser that doesn't support scroll snapping, and we get normal scrolling. No problem. Great. So there's many of these cases where we can just let it fail and be okay with that. There's this great example. This one is actually stolen sort of from Jen Simmons, and I'll link to hers later. But I think responsive heroes are a great example of the same concept. So I've got this full page hero and then some text below it. And not every browser is going to support that full page text. So we've got this, we're doing it by setting height 100 VH and display flex. And either one of those could fail in browsers that are not that old. So let's test each one. So without 100 VH being supported, we're just going to need some more padding here. So let's say padding 4M, 1M. Well, we can even probably go a little bit less. And there we get a decent fallback for height 100 VH not being supported. Now let's test with display flex not supported. And really all we need is some centering. Add that, text align center. And again, I'm not jumping into all of these different browsers. I'm just playing with it right here by commenting and uncommenting. So now we have the default that we want, a fallback for flex, a fallback for height, and what about both of them? If both of those go away, the fallback is still fine. So again, we're not really creating much of a fallback here. We're just letting those fail. We're only putting a little bit of code in there to give us a decent look in that fallback. Another thing we can play with is source order and allowing, relying on that fact that we can assign display several different times and just have it fall back to an earlier version. So when we're working with card layouts like this, we often get designs that give us this beautiful, nice, everything's aligned, but we'll notice that all the content's the same. And that's probably not going to be true in reality. So when I come into the demo, let's change which ones are visible here. And now they aren't all aligned. I mean, they're aligning these boxes, but it's not clear how they're sharing the space. And what we have is a grid on the body. We can visualize that grid. And everything is stretching to the grid, but none of the internals are aligning at all. And we want to change that somehow. So this is where we want to start using subgrids, which are very cool and currently only supported in Firefox. But to do that, we're going to change it so that each of these is spanning multiple columns, multiple rows. And so that means we need to make more rows for them to span. And then, oh, that's the internals of the card. There we're describing how the card itself is going to lay out. That gives us just a little bit better support there. Okay, so here's where we're going to repeat twice this 3 different rows. So auto, 1 fraction auto, which is exactly what we set up here on the cards themselves as in our fallback, but we're going to set that on the body. And then we want each card to span all 3 of those so that now they can use those as subgrid. They're not doing that yet, but now we could say grid template rows subgrid, and now all of them align together. They're also inheriting an extra gap there that we don't need, so we're going to remove the gap on the internal grid. And there we get everything aligned on the rows just by adding subgrid rows, and we can test without subgrid support there. And again, that fallback is good enough. The internals aren't aligned, but the cards are aligned and take up a reasonable space. We can do the same thing with columns to get our columns aligned. And again, we're just relying here on source order. So this grid template columns is overriding the grid template columns we have up here. So if it fails, we fall back to a reasonable fallback value, and that's the goal. So using the fact that we can set the same property multiple times and just put the newest one later, and if it fails, we'll fall back to an earlier one. We can do a lot by doing that. We also get support queries, which let us explicitly, very much like a media query, we can explicitly check what features are supported. And it looks very much like a media query at supports, and then inside the parentheses, we can say a declaration, a property, and a value, and see if that's supported, and change the code internally. So again, opening up a demo here, this time just playing with grids. Let's actually right away just play with at supports. Thing, nope. HTML, background, green. So thing, nope, is not supported by this browser because it doesn't exist. We can even change that to display, nope. And there's still no support for that combination, even though that's a real property. That's not a real value, so it's not supported. But if we change that to display grid, I must be at supports, display, grid, HTML. Haha, background. You have to put an N in background, who knew? So there it is with the thing actually working. Display grid, if it supports that entire thing, it will show whatever code is in here. Now I'm going to remove that code and play with actually how I do grids, even though I'm sometimes supporting browsers that don't have grid, I still want to play with it. So we're going to set the, looks like we're always overflowing, but in case we weren't, we're going to set the min height of this to 100 viewport height. We're going to set display grid on the body. And right away, not much change. The default display grid is very similar to a float, a normal flow. So we're not getting much difference there. We can add a grid gap though now, which means we don't have to add margins to each individual thing. And then this is where grids get really cool. We can do this named areas and then say how big they should be. So header, nav, main. The main's going to take up any remaining space. And then the footer, the whole thing is one fraction wide. And again, not much change there because I've described basically our mobile layout. But I can jump into a media query. At 40 ems, we want to change what that grid looks like. And now we're going to go to 2 columns, header, header, nav, main, nav, footer. And now we define 2 different column widths. And you can see that they jump 40 ems, might be a little small for it. They jump not exactly into the place that I want them because I need to assign each item to its area. And once I have those assigned, so you can see here we're doing like the nav comes all the way down and then the footer. Here I can change the layout just by changing that one line there. The only thing I can't do is go around corners, but otherwise I can move these things around however I want. Maybe the nav goes all the way up into the header. I don't know. Okay, so what I need now is a fallback for this, and we're going to use at supports to do it. So we're going to say, check it without display grid, because that's the fallback. All right, so now we've got a mobile, sort of mobile at all sizes. We're going to add that margin in And at this same min width media query that we used for the grid, we're going to do a float layout, float the nav left, give it a width, give it a little bit of a margin there, and say main overflow hidden, so it creates its own box. And there's our fallback. So the fallback's looking good. The problem now is some of those things break our grid. So we're going to have to remove them. So inside @supports display grid, we remove the things we don't want. So we can say, get rid of those margins. And the nav will say float. Well, float's just ignored, so we don't need that. But we will get rid of the margin right, unset that, and the width, unset that. And maybe we have to do that inside of the media query, inside of, or maybe we could just put it after, but yeah, let's try that. Because source order matters. So we'll just move it down here. And there we go. So we're not doing two entirely different layouts. We're sort of set up the first one, turn off grids, get the second one looking good enough, turn grids back on, and add a few little overrides to remove the difference. And I think grids are so fast and so powerful that it's really possible for us to start using them right away and have all that time left over to do like a simplified version of the fallback layout. I think that's a real powerful way to start using new features without waiting. We also have @supports selector, which is the same thing but for selectors, so we can check like @supports the marker selector, and we can add styles for that. I'm not going to dig into that one right now. And we get other media queries. Media queries aren't just about min width, max width, min height, max height. We get prefers color scheme, prefers contrast, prefers reduced motion, prefers reduced transparency. All of this access to user preferences in media queries. We get interface queries, like we can check what type of hover and what type of pointer are being used on a device, so we can target different types of interfaces, touch screens or stylus screens or gesture-based. We can target these with media queries that access the interface we're working with. So we really have the tools to do this, and we have the knowledge to do this, to design sort of resiliently and responsively and adapt to context. To do this impossible thing of fonts and colors on the web. This shouldn't be possible, and we do it anyway. We're doing this graphic design of unknown content on an infinite and unknown canvas across operating systems, interfaces, and languages. It's a fundamentally absurd and impossible thing that we're doing. And it's very much like live theater. We can write the script, and we can write even stage directions, suggestions, for what the browser should do for a performance, but each performance is always going to be totally unique. And this choose your own adventure, find the missing art box. But Anne Bogart reminds us that it takes craft to set up circumstances that are simple and yet contain the ambiguities and the incongruity of human experience and or the web. We can embrace this quantum browser support, this stop looking for yes and no is a feature supported, and start looking at how does this feature fall apart beautifully? How do we let the web fail beautifully? We can let the web fail beautifully. And that's a way that we show our care about people, the people on the other end of the screen, over some fascist idea of perfection as uniformity that doesn't care about individual people and individual preferences. This is really a radical, user-centered medium, and we can use that to create really radical designs that adapt to context. CSS is really unlike any other language. There is no language in the world trying to do what CSS is doing in this way. So when people say that CSS is weird or different, it's true. It's trying to solve a problem that should fundamentally be impossible. This reality of a flexible, multilingual, multi-web or multi-device web. And I've got more resources you can look at. I quoted from various of these. And like I said, Jen Simmons has some great videos on exactly these concepts, more exercises and demos on how to handle resilience, how to handle falling back. And of course, this is what Oddbird does for a living. So if you want help or training, we're available. But go forth and let the web fail beautifully.
Thanks so much, Miriam. That was great. I wish the hidden feature for like Zoom is applause or something, some digital answer to that, because I think you would be getting a full room of applause right now. Thank you so much. I think toward the end there, if people were watching it, it's clear that CSS can start getting really powerful. But I really like the fact that you're giving people permission to maybe not apply all of these fascist principles to design, because I think the reality is that we don't have full control over everything, and the permission to maybe just let that be a thing is really powerful in itself. So thank you. We have some questions. I know we're a little over, but if people, just as a reminder, we're recording this and we'll post it on our website. I answered that. That was a question. That'll be on designfordrupal.org shortly. Usually takes us a few days or so to get things edited and uploaded. But I have a few more questions that people are asking. If you don't mind sticking around, Miriam, do you have a little bit more time?
Sure.
Right. So the first question comes from Alyssa, and she was asking, in CSS, is there a way to query the user's personal settings?
Yeah, so that's where those, and maybe the question was asked before I got to it. But
yeah, I think it was.
We get those user preference queries, and there's various of them. And they're worth looking into. I mean, I use prefers color scheme here, which is what's giving me the dark background instead of a light background. But so if you load my slides, you might get a light background. But there's various ones that you can check there.
That's great. And I think to piggyback off of that, somebody was asking about whether you can do another session, maybe diving a little deeper into some of this, because I think that probably piqued a lot of people's curiosity. But just making note about the fact that some of these things aren't supported on all browsers. I think, is something like this supported on quote unquote all browsers at this point?
Something like shape outside?
No, like preference queries.
Oh, like preference queries? Preference queries, I think, have pretty good support. I mean, the place that I would start checking is MDN. They tend to, well, they've tended to be a little bit more up to date. Well, that's reports. I guess I'll just go there for now. But at media, if you check down at the bottom, MDN gives you this broken down for every single value that you can check for, who supports it and who doesn't. And there are some interesting things. Actually, if you watch Jen Simmons' video, she goes into at supports and how to handle when a browser doesn't support the support checker. I also talk about that in one of my Mozilla videos about support selector. So you can check those out. Those resources are there in the slides.
Great. Yeah, and there was a question about the shape outside and things like that. So it looks like folks can kind of check there. But I think the other thing to remember, like you said, is that you may use these things.
Yes.
Can you? Yes. May you? Yes. But
yeah, I use subgrid in production because it very quickly gives me a nicer thing that's not possible to do right now.
Right.
Otherwise, and I might as well make it available for the browsers that have it. And I have to build a fallback anyway. Why not just add that one-line subgrid declaration to get what I really want.
Sure. Let's see here. Got a couple other questions from Howard. Inspiring talk. Thank you. Is it okay to ask a newbie question? Is that so? The question about some of the tools you're using, they're wondering if it's dev tools and whether that was in Firefox.
Yeah.
And what are you using to edit those styles?
Yeah, this is Firefox dev tools, and I'm very sad about Firefox or Mozilla recently firing their entire dev tools team. Because these are the best CSS dev tools available right now, and hopefully they don't go away entirely. But here you can see it's actually ordered by the Cascade. So first we get in order of specificity, what's overriding what. And you can see like that width is overriding this other width, and you can toggle them on and off, which is a quick way to do that testing I was talking about. And if you scroll down, you get to, well, I have user agent styles turned on. There's a place in the settings to turn that on or off, whether you want to see those. And then down at the end, you would get to inherited styles that are coming in from elsewhere. But then I was in the style editor, which these rearrange, so they might not be in the same order for you. But the style editor shows you all of the style sheets. And in my demos here, I just had a demo style sheet that I would go to. You can also add new style sheets and just play around. It's sort of like having CodePen directly in the browser, which I think is great. And the grid editor is also, the grid visualization also comes with this. So I'm not sure why it's not showing. Oh, I have display grid unfocused, and I can click on grid and I can see that there's a Flexbox editor that's similar, and the shape editor that I showed you. I think those Mozilla videos I made with Jen Simmons, we cover various of the tools in there, and you can check those out.
That's great. We would love to have you back to dive deeper. Whether or not that happens, if somebody does want to start kind of checking out sort of non-basic features in CSS, what's your recommendation for them?
Often sites like CSS Tricks and Smashing have good articles on the new stuff that's coming out. My headphones quit. Can you hear me?
I can't. I lost you there. Oh, there you go. Yep.
So Rachel Andrew, Keith Grant, Jen Simmons, Estelle Weil, follow these people that are teaching a lot of this stuff, and they'll often have new material about the new toys. But yeah, CSS Tricks and Smashing are two of the places that I look when I have a question about something new.
Yeah, and I follow Miriam on Twitter, and she's always tweeting like these things that I've never heard of, like scroll snap. I didn't know that was a thing in CSS. That's awesome.
Yeah, I found out about it when I was doing those videos. So I have a whole video on how that one works if you want to check it out. All
right. So
but now now that I got to join the CSS working group, I found out about so many new things that I had never even heard of. And it's great.
That's great. I think we'll wrap it up here. I don't think there are any more questions, so I'm going to turn it back over to Leslie. Leslie, do you have any final comments?
No, I just want to thank Miriam so much. It was an awesome talk, and I'm sure that you helped out a lot of people with all your great information, so we really appreciate you coming on and helping us out with these webinars.
Sure.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Miriam.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll be in touch soon. Like I said, we are trying to find another speaker for October's talk. So if you're interested, please reach out, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.